Okay, I also want to thank the panelists and of course all the attendees as well. We have 4 people on our panel. We have Professor Beth Martin, a teaching professor in the Environmental Studies Department. We have Professor Scott Krumenacher, a lecturer in the same department. And then we have 2 student representatives. We have Damian Servideo from the College Republicans and Philip Keisler from the College Democrats. Panelists, your section is coming up, but before you start your section, could you just be sure to give a very brief introduction about yourself as well?
Great. Should I go first? Hi, everyone. My name is Philip Keisler. I'm a junior studying political science and history. I'm going to tell you a bit about Joe Biden, the Democratic Party's plan to address climate change. So the Democratic Party, as well as the Democratic nominee, acknowledge climate change as an existential threat to our planet and our generation. Joe Biden's plan calls for investing $2 trillion over 4 years and is the most aggressive stab at the problem of climate change that any major party nominee has put forward. Its broad overarching goal is to eradicate carbon pollution from the power sector by 2035 and achieve net zero emissions in the United States by 2050. Now I want to break down the basic kind of building blocks of this plan. To begin with, climate scientists and policymakers have kind of broken down climate policy into 2 main categories, adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation refers to how we can lessen the damage climate change wreaks on our society. How can we make the incoming droughts, severe storms, sea level rise, and of course wildfires less dangerous and harmful? That's why Joe Biden's plan calls for rebuilding our infrastructure to withstand the effects of climate change. He'll also create regional climate resilience plans to help improve the safety of communities in our country. This will be a major investment, but one that will not only employ more people, but also create a country that will be more able to adapt to some of the effects of climate change. The larger part of the plan, however, is mitigation. How can we decrease greenhouse gases to prevent catastrophic global warming, with a special emphasis on preventing warming above 2 degrees Celsius? The Biden plan looks critically across our entire economy to find ways we can reduce emissions with the end goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. The first aspect of this plan is looking at the transportation sector. Biden's plan for transportation seeks to increase efficiency and reduce emissions, acknowledging that transportation is one of the largest sectors responsible for greenhouse gas emissions in the United States at 29% of total emissions. Biden will make real investments to curb those emissions. He's pledged to ensure that every city with a population of over 100,000 people will receive funding to set up quality emission-free public transportation and invest in the infrastructure for pedestrians, cyclists, and light rail networks. This, combined with the pledge to have all US-made buses be zero emissions by 2030, will help decrease transportation emissions. In addition, Biden will accelerate electric vehicle production, increase tax incentives to buy electric cars, and deploy 500,000 new electric charging stations across the country while increasing fuel economy standards. In short, Biden will ensure that we have more public transportation and cleaner, greener cars. Secondly, Biden's plan of mitigation looks at how we can update our buildings and homes to reduce emissions. This includes, over this 4-year term, upgrading 4 million buildings and introducing legislation to have all commercial buildings have net zero emissions by 2030. Furthermore, he'll weatherize 2 million homes in order to make homes more efficient in how they use energy in both hot and cold times of the year. And he'll build an additional 1.5 million sustainable homes. He'll put incentives into play as well to encourage upgrades to more efficient home appliances and efficient windows. Through this, we can once again reduce emissions, and in broad strokes, Biden Democratic Party will invest in updating our buildings and homes. The third aspect is agriculture and conservation. The Democratic nominee is committed to creating jobs in climate-smart agriculture that will increase sustainability and reduce emissions. This is important because agriculture accounts for 9% of total US emissions. Biden has pledged to employ 250,000 people to also help clean up toxins in our communities and help promote conservation efforts across the country. Now, in addition to the sectors of our economy, it's also important to look at the fossil fuel companies themselves. Biden is committed to stopping the billions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuel companies that currently exist. Providing subsidies to fossil fuel companies is somewhat like paying someone to kick you in the shins, and so Biden will make sure to put an end to that. In addition, he'll invest in green energy and the innovation that we need to actually solve this problem in future years. So things like carbon capture, making sure that we can try and find ways to take carbon out of the air and instead of putting it in the ground, and greater storage technology for renewable energy. So we can see across all sectors of our economy that Biden and the Democratic Party have a plan to reduce emissions and promote clean, sustainable alternatives. The final piece of this puzzle, though, is environmental justice. It's no surprise in a country full of racial inequity that this inequity extends to pollution and climate change as well. Studies have shown that people of color live on average closer to pollution producers. Furthermore, while white families produce a disproportionate amount of pollution, it is Black and Latino families that breathe that pollution in disproportionately. That's part of why Biden's plan also embraces racial justice by investing in eliminating legacy pollution, especially in tribal communities and communities of color. It also means pledging 40% of clean energy spending benefits go to disadvantaged and marginalized communities. Finally, Biden will establish an environmental and climate justice division in the federal Department of Justice to hold polluters accountable. Now, that's in regard to domestic policy, but of course, climate change and global warming is a global issue. And so we can't lose sight of the fact that while the US does produce 14% of global emissions, there's a lot that other countries contribute as well. And so any solution has to be a global solution. That's why Biden plans to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and strengthen it as well. It means also supporting countries that are currently working to industrialize, to do so in a clean way, and to not penalize them for that. So this is what a large-scale climate plan that follows the science looks like. This plan doesn't solve every problem, and it could go farther. For instance, there have been calls to ban fracking, and of course, the Green New Deal is something that is probably on a lot of our minds as well. But organizations like the Sunrise Movement, the driving force behind the Green New Deal, have called this plan a major step forward. And after these elections, no matter the result, these voices will continue to push Biden's climate plan in a more progressive direction. While $2 trillion over 4 years might sound like a lot, if we reach 3.7 degrees Celsius, it will cost the world over $500 trillion by 2100, according to the IPCC. And that is not including the 250,000 deaths a year that climate change will cause between 2030 and 2050, according to the World Health Organization, if we stay on our current course. I hope that everyone can really engage in this important election and vote for the policies they believe will help solve this crisis. The deadline to register to vote is October 7th in Missouri, and you can do it online. In addition to voting, it's important to keep engaged after the election as well, so we can all work towards a livable plan in the future. Thanks so much.
Hey everybody, and thank you, Philip, for that presentation. So my name is Damiano Servideo, or Damien Servideo, if you prefer to call me that. And I'm studying political science and history, and I'm currently a junior at WashU. And I'm also going to be representing the college Republicans here during our session of the debate, of this discussion rather, not debate. So essentially, I'm going to go through the history of the Republican Party's climate policies and the general perspective that the Republican Party has had over time. So I'm going to start way back at the beginning of the 20th century and as quickly as possible move my way up to the present day, and then also give you guys some general ideas as to where the party is heading in the future and where it's likely to head. And I'll of course play special details to the current election. So Republican climate policy, and specifically Republican environmentalism, really began with Teddy Roosevelt, and in fact the 2016 party platform, which is now the 2020 party platform because I use the same one, specifically mentions Roosevelt and kind of brands him as the founder of environmentalism within the Republican Party, and it officially endorses his actions. So I'm sure you guys all remember him from history class, but his big deal was conservationism. So he set aside millions of acres of federal land, and his main goal was essentially to protect the economy and protect the environment by not allowing private industry to strip the country of its resources too quickly, and to allow, of course, citizens to enjoy the nature that this country has to offer. One of his main proponents was a man named Gifford Pinchot, who actually headed the Forestry Bureau during his administration. And this is where you can kind of see the basic, I guess you could say, interpretation of climate policy that began in the Republican Party. So his idea essentially was that with any climate policy that you can consider in government, you also need to consider the economic ramifications, because the economy is the tool that allows you to protect the environment. So if any policy compromises the integrity of the economy, then what you're doing is essentially throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're no longer able to protect the environment because you have damaged the economy irreparably. And there were two other schools that were going around in politics at the time. One, of course, was that the nature should be kind of preserved for its own respect, just for beauty. And there was a lot less emphasis on the economy. And then there was also another school led by a senator named Henry Teller that pretty much advocated against conservationism. It was entirely prioritizing the economy. Teller was a interesting guy. He was a Republican, then he was a Democrat, so he does a typical switcheroo. You can kind of envision him as the prototypical politician that just does what he needs to do to get elected. But that school, nonetheless, stayed existent throughout the 20th century. And that school also, I think, did influence some Republicans, as did the Pinchot School, which goes on to our next major development in Republican climate policy history under Richard Nixon. So you guys all, of course, know Richard Nixon. Many of the foundational legislation in American federal climate policy starts with him, actually. That includes founding the EPA, so the Environmental Protection Administration, and amendments to the Clean Air Act, as well as the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970. And all of these were meant to essentially promote the environment, especially to deal with pollution that was going on at the time. The EPA allows the federal government to essentially coordinate climate policy and also to enforce climate policy. So it really was a revolutionary agency. You can kind of consider it similar to Homeland Security in that it had not existed before, and it revolutionized the federal government's ability to come up with ideas to combat climate change, to come up with ideas to combat the degradation of the environment in a clear, consistent, and concise way that was enforceable by law. The Clean Air Act, you guys will all know that. It was actually passed in 1963, but there were serious amendments done to it in 1970 under Richard Nixon. That was supported by both parties in Congress, but Richard Nixon was a very vocal proponent of amending the Clean Air Act. So it established protocols to protect air, to protect through national ambient air quality standards, which you guys will probably know under NAAQS. State implementation plans, new source performance standards, and national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants. And this is revolutionary at the time. It's still one of the foundational climate legislations that the federal government has, and it's still in effect. So you could really see that Nixon followed the Gifford school. Now, I'm not arguing that Nixon knew who Gifford was or studied him, or that this necessarily was linked to Gifford, but he had a very similar outlook to Gifford Pinchot, which is essentially that you need to protect the environment, but you also need to protect the economy, because the economy is a tool for actually protecting the environment in the first place. So again, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. One of the most contradictory aspects of Nixon's legacy, environmental legacy, was his veto of the Clean Water Act, CWA, which was passed by Congress overwhelmingly during his tenure. And essentially it went significantly over budget for what he had preferred. And he vetoed it on that grounds. So in his veto statement, he explained that I actually support the substance of the legislation, but we can't afford this. This is during the time of stagflation. And he was concerned that too much government spending would increase inflation and prevent the economy from recovering in time. And the main administrator of the EPA then actually disagreed with him. And again, this is a partner of Richard Nixon, so someone who knew him very well and helped actually coordinate his own environmental policy with him. He thought that in the long run, there would be more economic benefits from passing the Clean Water Act than not passing it. So he thought it was worth doing huge spending in the short term in turn for economic savings in the long run, like fighting climate change later on or environmental degradation later on. And Congress ended up overriding the veto anyway. So the Clean Water Act is still in effect. It is still one of the revolutionary legislation on climate policy that we have. But nonetheless, this little episode in history explains a huge divergence in the party. This is where this Pinchot school of thought, if you can really call it that, starts to diverge. Both Nixon and the administrator of the EPA could be described as supporters of Pinchot's outlook, whether they knew it to be his outlook or not. They both believed that the economy and the environment went together. They both needed to be protected at the same time. But they disagreed on the pragmatic implementation of that plan. How much do we spend? Do we spend a lot more in the short term? Do we spend a lot more in the long term? Because again, this whole policy tends on protecting short-term and long-term economic interests. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Republicans in the party ended up distorting Nixon's view. So this is where you have kind of a resurgence of this idea of, no, prioritize the economy only, don't protect the environment. And that there's both wings exist in pretty large proportions within the party still. It would be an exaggeration to say that all Republicans deny climate science. There's a lot of Republicans who do that, but not all of them. In 2000, for example, the party's platform still endorsed the view that the environment and the economy had to be protected, with an emphasis on specifically protecting free market approaches to protecting the environment. So essentially like tax incentives for adopting clean energy resources or for researching them, as well as some investments in clean energy. And a very unique part of the Republican platform has been an emphasis on nuclear energy. That's of course controversial, but countries like France went nuclear, and they've been fine. This has always been very popular in the Republican Party. And it could be a very, very practical solution. It's one of the most efficient modes of getting energy, and it would allow us to stop relying on fossil fuels as much. In 2008, most candidates also supported this kind of 2000 view of allowing a free market approach, investing in clean alternatives. So ethanol was really popular in the party at the time, as well as nuclear fuel, of course. And another unique aspect, the Republican Party opposes carbon taxes. And the reason for this is mainly economic. The idea that that type of tax is not really a big burden on wealthier citizens, but it is a very big burden on working class and middle class citizens, because they have less buying power, so it makes it harder for them to buy gas, for example. So that's an idea of mixing economic and environmental concerns. Now we move on to Trump, which is where you see this type of climate denial aspect take control a little bit, though I don't think it's going to last much longer. So Trump, as everyone knows, left the Paris Agreement. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. I happen to think it's overblown. This is a lot of Republicans think it's overblown. Not so much because we think Trump should have left, but because leaving and staying in doesn't really bind the country to anything. The Paris Agreement, of course, it's an international agreement that has no enforcement mechanisms inside it. In the end, each country can do what they want. In fact, Putin, believe it or not, of all people, was asked by Megyn Kelly what he thought about Trump leaving. And his answer, which I think is stereotypical of a Putin-type person, so not good, but unfortunately very true, was that, I don't understand, and I'm paraphrasing, but you could look this up, Megyn Kelly interview with Putin on it. He goes, oh, well, I'm not so sure why he left. That probably wasn't a good idea. He could have stayed in it and ignored it all anyway, because it's a framework and it's unenforceable. Unfortunately, I think a lot of countries are going to do that. I personally support being in the Paris Agreement. But again, a lot of people in the party will tell you this is not the be-all end-all, because ultimately speaking, any international approach to climate, which is you have to do that if you want to reduce emissions and stop climate change, needs some type of agreement that has enforceable mechanisms within it. If you don't do that, you're stuck in a type of prisoner's dilemma where both people are just going to try to abuse the economy, abuse the environment as much as possible, because there's no reason not to, unless you have some type of external force preventing that. So that's actually where we move into the future of the party. The party, of course, is always opposed over excessive regulation of the economy. But there's a very important part about the future of the party. Most young members or younger members, the millennial members of the party and below, think that climate change is real and that it is man-made, caused by men. But they do have still unique solutions to it that differ from the democratic outlook. Now, both parties, of course, both future wings of the parties have the same goal in mind, which is to protect the environment. So there's no reason to attack either of them on that. That's a very good goal that we should have. That's very important to protect our economy, even in the long run, to do that. But the Republican approach emphasizes on essentially not destroying the economy in the short term so that you're unable now to spend money in the future on those issues, unable to any longer implement any of the plans you have against climate change. So of course, hydropower is still very popular. Nuclear energy is still very popular among the youth in the party and among many of its more moderate center-right members. Of course, investing money and doing tax incentives for research and the production of other clean types of energy. Again, nuclear energy is just one example, but other types of research is perfectly fine too, including wind, solar, etc. That's all mentioned in the platform. And of course, they want to be able to incentivize the free market to take charge of this. So we want companies to find it that's more economical for them to endorse cleaner alternatives to fuel, rather than implementing things like, for example, a carbon tax before there's a viable alternative for poorer Americans to be able to purchase, like, for example, electric car. It's not really an option for many poorer Americans to do that immediately. Now, of course, this policy hasn't come to fruition yet. Right now, I do still want to emphasize the 2016-2020 platform. Again, opposing a carbon tax still exists. Trump is obviously very, very vocal about supporting fossil fuels. The main goal in this is to make the United States energy independent. So, for example, drill American oil instead of getting it from the Middle East or other countries, for example. And job expansion with any type of clean energy alternatives. The idea, of course, for both parties is to make sure that people are employed in those sectors and that any clean energy alternatives that we adopt are American-based. I think that that's obviously laudable, and there's bipartisan support for that. Another very interesting thing that a lot of people don't mention is the USMCA. This is where one of those type of enforcement mechanisms on international climate policy comes into play. Of course, if you trade with a country with less environmental regulations than you, it becomes cheaper for American businesses to do business there and to produce their goods there, and any other business for that matter. That's why, for example, we just reformed NAFTA with Canada and Mexico, because Mexico did not have as harsh or as severe environmental regulations as the United States and Canada. And the goal of both parties, again, in this case, was to reform that so that Mexico would have to increase its environmental standards. And the Republican Party was very, very supportive of this. And of course, they're the ones who drafted the USMCA with Canada and Mexico. And this was a big goal of theirs. In the future, you're going to have to see any type of multilateral or bilateral trade agreement have mechanisms like this, where some type of economic punishment can be made on countries that don't implement the environmental policies that they sign themselves up for. So in this case, of course, if Mexico, for example, doesn't increase their environmental regulations, they wouldn't benefit from free trade with the United States or Canada. This is why they won't do that. They are going to implement environmental regulations because they don't want that cost to be accrued to them. And I think that this is a very unique Republican Party platform. Any type of alternative to the Paris Agreement or any type of amendment to the Paris Agreement in the future is going to require some mechanism that allows the largest of developing countries, whether this be in Europe, whether this be the United States, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, the big five on the Security Council, somehow have to be able to economically punish countries that deviate from their obligations. That's what you need, or else it's going to be, a anarchic system where everyone just does what they want and they'll sign a piece of paper and not end up abiding by it. So again, that's my policy. I want to thank Philip again for introducing the democratic policy, and I look forward to hearing the rest of this presentation and hearing any questions that you guys have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damien. For this next part, we're going to have Professor Krummenacher talk about the history of environmental policy. I'm just stepping in to say that I'm about to share my screen, just as a warning.
Thank you, Bennett. Hi, I'm Scott Krummenacher. I'm a lecturer in environmental studies. I teach and do research in the area of sustainability and especially local policies related to the environment. So I'll be talking a little bit about just a broad context for the emergence of climate policy in the United States. I'll transition more into the modern context and talk about specific policy types and public attitudes toward addressing climate change in the current system. So Bennett, if you could move to the next slide, please. So probably if you're thinking about issues of climate change or environmental issues generally, and you're thinking about the politics surrounding it, what comes to mind is conflict. We are hot on the heels of the last debate, which was fairly intense, and people have strong views, and those views are often confrontational, right? So maybe the general impression that you have in mind is one of partisanship and polarization, and that when you look at the modern context, you see on a range of environmental issues. So polarization certainly does exist. It's clear on not just climate issues, but things like public lands policy, et cetera. But I'm going to make the case that some of that is maybe overstated, and we are coming to a point where issue salience is going to be heightened, and that sort of issue salience is likely to translate into more direct action on climate and climate-related policies. Bennett, if you could move to the next slide. So I'm going to start just by giving you a modern context for the evolution of environmental and climate-related policy. And I want to start with the environmental decade. We could go back even further and look at sort of the origins of things like air pollution regulations, and talk about cities like London and Chicago, and go there. But instead, I want to ground this in a more modern context. And the real thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the modern history of environmental policy is the environmental decade. The decade of the 1970s was just a pivotal moment for environmental policy. And we've heard mention a number of these important policies like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, et cetera, which emerged during this time period. And a lot of what we think of today as sort of precursors, or what are foundational for addressing climate change in any way through the policy system, come from these foundational moments. And so the National Environmental Policy Act, which I think is maybe underrepresented in the landscape of precursors to climate policy, is really important here for setting the context. Maybe our earliest formal mention of sustainable development by national federal policy in the United States. And of course, the Clean Air Act was notable for addressing air pollution, and later, again, becoming the precursor for regulating greenhouse gas emissions. And I think what's sometimes missed in this picture, energy policy is crucially important to addressing climate change in any way. And we start to see the emergence of at least some very real concern about energy as a major policy issue during the 1970s. We also see some really important policies that address climate change in one way or another. And the real important policy to note here is the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And that particular act put in place mileage standards for motor vehicles. And that's something that is likely to be really important to addressing climate concerns in the modern context. Another really important note is that when you think about environmental problems during this time period, the public was really galvanized around environmental issues. They were certainly supportive of doing just about anything to address these problems, because these problems were very real to their personal experience. When people walked outside, they directly experienced air pollution. People confronted water pollution regularly. And so there was this heightened sense of awareness, and what's sometimes referred to during this decade as the miracle of public opinion. The public was really supportive of taking action. And what this led to was strong support across party lines for addressing the environment in any way. And so environmental issues were good politics, not just for Democrats, but also Republicans. And so politicians across the board embraced addressing the environment in some way through policy, through direct action. And that's a reflection of the public sort of uptake of environmental issues and strong demand for addressing those issues in some way. Bennett, if you could move to the next slide. One way to get a sense for that is to look at what are known as League of Conservation Voter scores. The League of Conservation Voters rates various politicians on their environmental voting patterns. It's an interest group, of course, but generally their view is that if you're doing things to support the environment through policy, you're your voter score is higher. If you're not, your voter score is lower. And so what we see here is there's at least some convergence in the 1970s for both parties on environmental issues. It's certainly not, I don't want to overstate this and say that the views were exactly the same. But that said, there was, again, good politics here across party lines for addressing environmental issues. And it wasn't until much later that we started to see a real divergence in views when we think of what we think of today as polarization on environmental issues. And so the phenomenon of polarization that we see today is really a fairly recent phenomenon. And there are, again, these moments in environmental history where we see this convergence and these important moments to act, right? So keep in mind, 1970s, problems were severe, the public was galvanized to take action, and politicians followed suit and made it good politics. Right? That's really important for thinking about climate change in the policy future. Right, so Bennett, if you could move to the next slide. Why do I say that? Well, you can see that in polling data about how people think about global warming. Is the view of global warming generally exaggerated? Is it correct or underestimated? And for a time, you could see that, you know, that it was exaggerated. That sort of carried the day. But that has changed recently, and we're starting to experience the effects of climate change directly in the general public, whether it's wildfires or stronger storms, are starting to react and respond to the salience of the issue, the importance of this issue in people's everyday lives. And that's reflected in public opinion surveys. People are starting to react to that, and it's starting to resonate with the general public. And that sense of resonance for environmental issues is crucial to getting action. And if we start to see this for climate issues, chances are our politicians are going to do something, right? So policy is going to matter, and we can expect some kind of action to be taken in the near term if this trend holds. Bennett, can you move forward? And so what kind of action could politicians take? Well, when you're thinking about climate policy, you should be thinking about various types of policies. One way to think about that is you've got policies that work on the cause, climate mitigation policies, and policies that work on the effects or the adaptation policies. And so you could structure policies in ways that address the causes through mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, or you could be thinking about responding to a warmer world, dealing with sea level rise in major urban centers, for example, in coastal areas could be an important climate adaptation policy. And we heard mention climate justice as being important, and so you could think of, you know, ways in which that's structured, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side, to address the issue of low-income communities and communities of color. Another really important way to think about types is direct versus indirect. So you could have things that work directly on, say, the causes of the problem. So they could directly regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Or those policies could indirectly influence greenhouse gas emissions in some way. An example of an indirect approach here might be something like transportation policy, where spending on federal highways could be reduced, and instead those investments could go to other modes of transportation that produce less in the way of greenhouse gas emissions. And that could be a crucial step toward remedying the greenhouse gas emission problem by combining those two things. Bennett, if you could move forward. And so what do we classically think of then falling within those various categories? I want to just talk briefly about the role of these different policy options and how they've been put in place by various governments in the United States, and then talk a little bit about what that could mean going forward. So we'll start with the carbon tax, the four-letter word in US policy. Carbon taxes have been tried and in many cases have failed. You know, famous recent examples include Washington State. And when you think about carbon tax as a solution to climate problems, I think it's really important here to be thinking about the way in which the tax is structured. And so tax structures matter a great deal. It could be a tax that falls more heavily on the consumer side so that the consumer is responsible for most of the tax burden. Those tend to be really unpopular. Or it could be structured in a different way so that the tax burden falls primarily on those producing those greenhouse gas emissions most directly. And yes, you can make the argument that those costs could be passed on, but to the extent that you directly tax those producers, those carbon taxes tend to be more popular than those that affect consumers directly. And so sort of tax policy structure makes a difference in orienting the public toward either supporting or opposing these different options. Another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about carbon taxes is where the revenue goes. And so this language sometimes deals with what happens at the back end. So what happens when you get the revenue from the carbon tax? Does it funnel into more clean energy investments, or is it something that is broadly distributed among the public? That also matters in the support of the carbon tax. Another option is one you're probably likely familiar with if you know much about climate policy, and that's cap and trade or some emissions trading scheme. We've seen these already applied in the United States at the state level. So California is maybe most notable for their cap and trade system. These emission trading schemes can vary in their nature, but generally it's setting a cap on total emissions and then allowing others to trade permits or allowances under that cap. And the idea is that market forces in that system would incentivize others to reduce their overall emissions. The regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory is another sort of multi-state example of how that might look. Another option could be emissions regulations. So here it could be sort of direct requirements placed on utility companies where it could be renewable portfolio standards where they're intending to adopt renewable energy at a certain level by a certain date. It could be overall targets for utilities to adopt a certain threshold of clean or renewable energy by a certain date as well. Efficiency measures could also be useful here. And here again, the mileage standards example is really salient. We want, as we're thinking about things like vehicle electrification or making sure that we get some fuel efficiency from our vehicles, mileage standards can go a long way in reducing our overall greenhouse gas emissions. And then last but not least, when you're thinking about possible options, one that I want to point to that I think is really important because it's really popular is research and development. Across the board for both self-identified Democrats and Republicans, research and development, investments in R&D for climate change are overwhelmingly popular. And by popular, I mean support greater than 70%. And that's a really high standard. And the good news here is that we've seen at least some of that both proposed and enacted. The American Reinvestment and Recovery Act did funnel money into clean energy development, into clean energy investments. And we see that articulated some in the Green New Deal proposals, the various ones that have been floating around. I expect that we'll see a lot more of that, and I expect that we'll see those from both sides because they could support either view. If conservatives want to use market forces, R&D investments could be critical to spurring some innovations. Democrats want that sort of investment too, to translate into, again, more innovation on the, especially the clean energy front. And so these are just a range of options. Most of these options are pretty popular with the general public. And so if you think about all of these options listed, maybe the only one that doesn't get strong support is a specific iteration of the carbon tax, especially the carbon tax that falls most heavily on the consumers. But for many of them, the good news here is that they're quite popular as options. And of course, one that's not listed is the alternative, which is not to have federal intervention, but instead to really rely on the market. And certainly there's a case to be made that market forces themselves could generate the kind of innovation that we need to address climate solutions. And maybe a more market-friendly or business-friendly approach could support that. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop here and turn it over to Bennett and Beth, and you guys can take it from there.
So hi all, I am Beth Martin. I'm a teaching professor in the Environmental Studies program. I'm also the interim director of our climate change program, as well as the focal point for the research and independent NGOs that participate in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what I've been tasked with today is to talk a little bit about kind of the broader context of the Paris Agreement and what it means to be involved and be engaged in the Paris Agreement. Bennett, can you go to the next slide? So the first thing to think about is the Paris Agreement comes out of the United States' participation in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I do want to point out that this was a treaty that was signed in 1992, and it was signed by President George H.W. Bush, and it was ratified by the Senate. So the U.S. entered into and agreed to abide by the UNFCCC, and it was supported kind of across parties. And the objective of this framework convention, and Damien mentioned that, it's a framework convention, is the parties can achieve stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentrations at a level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. It acknowledges, right, that there's a need to consider economic development, food production, and ecosystems. So that's the kind of the underlying objective, and you'll hear that referred to as kind of the Article 2 objective of the UNFCCC. You can go to the next slide. So the Paris Agreement, so fast forward 20 years, and under the UNFCCC, we saw that the world worked on the Kyoto Protocol, and that was a tool of which to try to reduce emissions worldwide, and didn't work as well as I think most all would have wanted it to. And so that led to the development of the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement does a lot of things. I'm going to focus in particular on what's called nationally determined contributions, or how each country can essentially sets their own goals. So one of the things in the Paris Agreement is that it really encourages countries to acknowledge and keep temperatures to a warming of below 2 degrees, and to really pursue efforts to limit that to 1.5 degrees. And that came about from significant advocacy, particularly on behalf of small island states during the negotiations on the Paris Agreement. Go ahead to the next slide. So in the Paris Agreement, like I said, there's a lot of things that the Paris Agreement does do, but really one of the core of the Paris Agreement is something called its ambition mechanism. And ambition in this context is thinking about how are countries reducing their emissions. Like, their ambition really addresses the amount of emissions reductions that they're pursuing. And so the way in which the Paris Agreement does this is a bottom-up approach. Essentially, they ask each country to prepare what's called their nationally determined contributions. And those nationally determined contributions, each country articulates, here's what we can do in our country to reduce emissions. Some countries go a little bit further and say, here's what we can do in our country to reduce emissions. And then here's what additional we could do if we had some type of support, whether that be financial support, technological support, human capacity, but it kind of differentiates, here's what we can do on our own, and here's what we can do with the support of others. The way in which the Paris Agreement works is like, that's great, but the idea is acknowledging that those first plans put out probably wouldn't be sufficient, and that every 5 years there'll be a new set of plans ideally what, thinking about ratcheting tighter and tighter so that we end up meeting that goal of no warming above 2 degrees or preferably 1.5 degrees. So this diagram really kind of highlights that you have what's on top is a global stock take and on bottom are the NDCs. And the stock take is where there's kind of collective assessment of how the world is doing in terms of meeting these goals of the Paris Agreement. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So the NDCs, as you might imagine, really ran the gamut when countries first put their NDCs on the table. Some were stronger than others, and some were not. This particular image here is an assessment that was done by an NGO where they evaluated the NDCs as far as how compatible they were with the 2-degree goal. The US is critically insufficient because it announced its withdrawal. So that one, in some ways, is a little off. It really isn't evaluating the US's NDC, but as it stood when it was submitted, but it addresses the fact that the US now doesn't have one. I'm going to the next slide. So collectively, all of the NDCs that the countries put together under their kind of pledges and targets get us to a range between, roughly 2.5 to 3.5 degrees warming, which is overshooting where we want to be. And that's really referred to as the emissions gap, the gap between where we want to be and where we're going to be. Go ahead and do the next slide. This particular slide highlights, I think Damien mentioned the different countries and the different production levels with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. You see on the left, in terms of overall emissions, China is at the top, and then followed by the US and the EU. On the right, it relooks at emissions in terms of a per capita basis, which is how some countries really like to think about their emissions in terms of a per capita basis rather than in a total basis. So as countries are putting together all of their different emissions plans, they're often talking in different ways and based on their internal and domestic priorities. Go ahead to the next slide. So the US, when the US as part of the Paris Agreement, we put forth what was called our nationally determined contribution. So you can think of it as essentially the US saying, what are our goals? And then how do we go about meeting them? And so the goals for the US were to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, with the best efforts to really get to that 28%. So that essentially was the goal. Go ahead to the next slide. On this one, you also see that there was also a long-range goal. The Obama administration put forth a mid-century strategy to reach 80% levels by 2050. Go ahead to the next slide. So what this slide highlights is that question of how do we meet them? So when the Obama administration put forth their plan for here's our NDCs, here's our goals, and here's how we're going to meet them. So what you'll see in the black are the ways in which the Obama administration wanted to meet those. So primarily under the Clean Air Act, under fuel economy standards, the Clean Power Plan, thinking about methane emissions, under energy independence and security, building sector emissions, building codes, federal government operations. What you see under that and kind of the light brown and then red is how the Trump administration has addressed some of the Obama administration's ideas on how to achieve these standards. So I think, what you begin to see here is that there's a different, the Trump administration did announce that they were withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. So by withdrawing under the terms of the Paris Agreement, then they had to, you cannot withdraw until after it had been in effect for 3 years. At that point, you could submit a 1-year notice of withdrawal. So the Trump administration submitted a 1-year notice of withdrawal last year. So as of November, the US will not be a part of the Paris Agreement. But I think what's important here and what's important to think about is whether part of the Paris Agreement or not is what are our goals and how are we going about meeting them? And so what we, like I was saying earlier, what you see here are two different perspectives on maybe on what the goals are, but also how you might go about meeting those goals. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is just a little bit of an FYI for all of you. As you'll see when Bennett describes the activity, this might be something that is helpful to think about. The National Climate Assessment is required to be done every 4 years. And so this is a document that looks at the impacts, risk, and adaptation to the US. It's the second volume. The first volume looks at the science of climate change. Go ahead to the next slide. So essentially, the summary kind of coming out of this report, right, is that the climate is changing. These are the results of human activities. The impacts are being felt across the country. Americans are responding in ways to reduce risk, build resilience. But global efforts and regional efforts don't yet approach the scale necessary to really avoid damage to the US economy, environment, and human health. I think it's important to note that, that this report did come out under the Trump administration. And so I think that that's important, that these are things that we're all thinking about and dealing with. One thing I wanted to add real quick, I wanted to go back to something Damien had mentioned about the Paris Agreement and enforcement. One of the challenges of international treaties is how do you enforce them? And so the ambition mechanism that I mentioned really is what tries to get at countries putting forth their individual domestic policies, seeing that they're not quite good enough, and then there becomes a little bit of political peer pressure that countries will put on each other to make their next round of commitments more ambitious and stronger. And I think that there's good questions raised about what are the best ways in order to put that pressure on individual countries to both meet the commitments that they've put out there and to perhaps think about how do you make your commitments the next go round even more ambitious and stronger. And I think that there's a lot of area for discussion and debate about what are the most effective ways to do that. Next slide. I think I'm done. Oh, sorry. I wasn't quite done. This is the, I kind of like went one topic to another topic and back to this one. I apologize for that. This is the table of contents for the National Climate Assessment. So you'll see that it addresses different topics from water to agriculture to energy to forest to air quality. Also, and then it looks at the impacts in specific regions of the US. And it breaks it down by regions. So it's a handy tool, and it's something that is really interesting to take a quick look at, particularly, what does it say about the Midwest, or what does it say about the region of the country that you're from? Now I'm officially done.